So this is another way of looking at microorganisms. So once again, we have the microorganism-macroorganism divide. Not everybody uses the word macroorganism. It's not really a legitimate word, but increasingly it seems microorganisms are a little fed up in that the people who study big things can say, oh yeah, and then they're the microorganisms. Well, if we have the term macroorganism, then the people who study the microorganisms say, oh yeah, then they're the macroorganisms, the big things. So the big things basically are the plants, the animals, and the fungi. Those are three different kingdoms in what's known as the five-kingdom system: kingdom Plantae, kingdom Animalia, and kingdom Fungi. Also big in photosynthetic are the multicellular algae, and there's also these things called slime molds, which are pretty big themselves. They're definitely macroscopic. So those are the big things, the macroorganisms, and they're related to small things. So the algae, the plants are basically just modified green algae. They're greatly modified green algae, but they're just modified green algae. They're basically seaweed that came onto land. And then there's all the other seaweeds that are still in the water. Elodea, by the way, which we've played around with in lab a lot, is actually a plant. It's a flowering plant. So it's a sophisticated organism. It somehow found its way back into water, but it's not, it is truly not an algae. It's a plant. The slime molds are actually similar in their way to the animals, and these guys came from single-celled organisms called protozoa, and there are similar types of protozoa today that exist that are similar to the simplest of the animals. And then there's the fungi. The fungi, the microscopic types are the molds and the yeasts. It's clear that the fungi came from, in fact, a protist-type organism. But the yeasts and the molds didn't necessarily give rise to the macrofungi. In fact, the yeast and the molds are related in strange and complicated ways to the bigger fungi. But nevertheless, the fungi ultimately came from something small, and that there are also small fungi that still exist today. In addition, there are the prokaryotes. So these are the bacteria and the archaea: domain bacteria, domain archaea, and then we have domain eukarya, which is everything else. And where did the eukaryotes come from? They probably came from some kind of fusion between the bacteria and the archaea. Minimally, what we probably had that gave rise to the eukaryotes was something like an archaean that took on a mitochondria, which came from the bacteria.